Hello everyone, welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's events discuss about selection of appropriate techniques for risk assessment. The webinar will be conducted by Mr. Joshua Albarina, the Senior Consultant for ISO Programs of SaaS Management. His areas of expertise are sustainability, quality, Six Sigma, asset and risk management. I wish you all a great webinar.
All right, thank you very much, Alba, and good day, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on risk management. Today, I will be talking more about selecting the appropriate risk assessment techniques. So this is something not technically a new subject, although we all know being professionals experienced in handling risk management within an organization or in the enterprise. So we're very much acquainted with the risk assessment techniques, from the identification, analysis, and evaluation and treatment. So we are very fond about those risk assessment techniques. But in this case, the challenge of us taking a step forward, or should we say improving further on risk assessment techniques, happens to be always a very clinch question, and when we are always more keen on what techniques are we going to use. So we're going to talk about a bit. Of techniques, but more importantly, what makes us the right decision or critical thinking, or use critical thinking in selecting the risk assessment techniques. Although in this session, we will be more focused on the critical aspects or the critical thought points on selecting the techniques depending on the context. As we all know that selecting the techniques will vary depending on the context where we are. So the flow of our today's discussion, this will be the rundown of the forum, or the 30-minute session that we have. We're going to have a quick look on the 31,000 framework. So we just have to have a refresher thought about what's enterprise risk management about, so to speak. If you have already taken up the 31,000 certified risk manager, that will be a big advantage to you. Or the 27,005 risk management in information security, that will be also a great advantage to you as well. And then moving forward from the 31,000 framework, we're going to go deep now on the third block of the framework, which is the risk assessment. As you are aware that in 31,000 framework, we have 3 sections to look at. We're going to talk about a bit on the bottom line, the risk assessments, but the difference is we're going to focus now on the bottom line of having what really is, or what really makes a good risk assessment, and that is the third section of this discussion. And having talk about the critical points, having the good risk assessment, we're going to be browsing several references that correlates with 31,000, and that there are some points in that risk assessment that we ought to see, and that we're going to put it on right here in this discussion. So we're going to try our best to squeeze those thought points in just a matter of 15 minutes. And then after getting yourself acquainted with the thought points, rather than talking about techniques, although we're going to talk about a bit, but we're going to focus more on the thought points, we're also going to close this session with the 31,000 guideline. By then you should also have a hand on the 31010, or the collaborating standard on your risk assessment tools and techniques. And by that, we shall now start. We all know that 31,000 consists of 3 blocks, and this contains the major framework of enterprise risk management, the way we all know risk management is. And as much as most of the experts would say that, and would also affirm, that for you to have an effective risk assessment, to create value on that, you need to have a good sense of managing the practice, and that is in the form of risk management. And for that risk management to be fully enabled and to see what is the great value to the organization, you have to make them first get the buy-in, taking in the 11 principles. as clearly defined in the 31,000 guideline. So as you can see here, we run a back on the framework itself. But if we're going to move forward now, we now put our focus on the third block, which is the risk assessment, and we try ourselves to take an answer to the question, what makes a good risk assessment? So when we talk about the third block, of course, we'll first trickle our way down from in the risk assessment techniques, beginning with identification phase. So let's start with this very critical step, or should we say an equally critical step in the risk assessment, which is risk identification. So when we identify risk, we talk about events, we talk about assets, we talk about risk sources. To simplify things up, we have to, based on the context that we had, or based on the context we identify, we have ourselves face the challenge of finding what are these uncertainties that really can cause impacts to the organization if there's a given several threats. That's the heart of identification phase. And in identifying the steps, or should we say in the process of it, we have several techniques to help us. Well, of course, this will also bridge itself in the in the succeeding parts, but we're going to introduce something about some of the techniques. In 31010, the techniques are classified into 7, as you can see there in the screen, and human and organizational factors are also recognized significantly when in the process. It makes also perfect sense since conducting these risk assessment techniques would really take in human factors through the perspective of the analyst when assessing the context, of course, given several concrete data from the organization. So we're now clear with the identification phase. We now step in to having a deeper understanding about this list of uncertainties we have formally elicited in the previous phase. So when we talk about analysis, it is about giving these identified risks a deeper level of understanding by putting ourselves to answering 2 questions. What are the impacts and what are the possibilities that it happens? For some of the techniques, there will be also several factors, several questions like if FMEA, there's also the third factor comes in. What is the chance of having it detected? And that is, FMEA is one of the 31 techniques defined in 31010. So to put it, regardless of the techniques, there are always 2 things that in this phase has been talked about. What is the impact and what is its probability? With that, with those 2 factors, we point up ourselves on what is its corresponding risk levels. And in this section, this is more like the more statistical component of risk assessment, since in most practices we always associate descriptive and qualitative and quantitative analysis, or a combination of both, to come up with a certain number most of the time, or to come up with a certain level of risk in which it helps us appreciate the what impact does this bring to the organization, and with these impacts recognized, it helps us move on to the next phase. Before we go for that, by practice, in analysis phase, we typically use estimation methods and consequence analysis. So we have several techniques like the combination of a cause and effect analysis with the fishbone diagrams, bow tie analysis, and then also for data-intensive assessments, we go for statistical methods like the Monte Carlo simulation method, and then the Markov analysis, the Bayesian techniques, and more of the statistical methods, and also the quasi-statistical type. We have the fault tree, event tree, failure modes, effects analysis. So all of these factors, the bottom line is that it challenges the assessor in putting up a certain figure. And that would give us a good level, a good level of risk, which we'll be using it to evaluate them based on a given criteria by the organization. This is the evaluation phase. This gives us a hint now that we know the levels, we want to know what comes first. And we always put them on heat map and on risk maps and sometimes in tabulated form. But the bottom line is it gives us an idea what to give us a sorting advantage to identify what type of risk should I treat first, should I put this on the first, on the bucket list of what to do, and then what to anticipate. Of course, as much as we have passed through all the first 3 levels, and then we're going to proceed with the next stage of treating risk, one thing is for sure, a risk assessment and treating the risks does not give you an absolute guarantee that it is treated 100%. There will be always residuals. And as per completely explained, despite the fact that there's an inherent risk when you treat them, there will be always left with residuals. And that shows that regardless of the techniques, it's not at all time a perfect choice. But what's clear is that we can mitigate it for most, as is concretely defined in 31,000 and in 31010. So I have already mentioned in the past few minutes, I've introduced several techniques, and after running through on the risk assessment methodology, the risk assessment sequences, we're now in the core of answering the question, what makes a good risk assessment then? So we have 3 factors to use that, because of course it goes without saying that the management has already given you a mandate. Given that you have done risk assessment, it also naturally follows that they have already had a good risk management framework in place. And why not? It should be because the risk management framework enables the organization to create value from every risk assessment conducted within the context of the organization. So having said that it's a management framework, there are factors that one organization or the risk manager must take into full consideration. First is when you do a risk assessment, do you have the right resources? Is the technique doable within the bounds of my resources? That's number 1. And then number 2, based on the context of where you are after fully identifying the internal context, the external context, the expectations of your stakeholders, and what's in it for you when you're going to do a risk assessment, is the technique that you're going to use exactly appropriate to the context of the organization? Because not at all time you can use a cause and effect analysis when all you need to do is to have an intensive statistical analysis on it. It doesn't make sense. So you have it should be also, and I will mention it a bit, that and also for in some of you who have attended several risk assessment risk management seminars or risk assessment seminars or risk management seminars, it's very clear and apparently so that for one to do an effective risk assessment, you got to be very expert on it. That means you get to have the experience, the skills, the attitude when it comes to it. In short, to simplify things up, you're more of an expert in the field where you chose to be. And this second factor would really represent that aspect. The third one is you're familiar with the technique, right? It's easy. You can who can do a fault tree analysis and event tree analysis? You can do that technique. Yes, it's fine. But can the whole team do it? Not all members can do it, or at least a few can do it, but not as intensive as one. So we're talking about the complexity of the application. Is it something that everyone can do? More importantly, when you do it and have the results clear, is it something that your management can understand? In most of the seminars, most of the meetings, you're only given a short fraction of their time to listen to you. So with that little span of time, you ask yourself, what would be the right message for me to tell them? And if the result of my analysis would take me long periods of time, I have to change my skill. I have to change my technique. I got to make sure that my tools should properly interpret the assessment, that should interpret what the top management expects of you. And when the management sees the value behind it, only then can we properly say that the technique is there. So specifically, there are some things we can classify eventually, which is a good start. So now I'm putting down things. What are the specific factors to look at? So we have the objectives of the study, the needs of the decision makers, the types and range of risks being analyzed, potential magnitude of the consequences. I mentioned earlier the degree of expertise and the resources needed, and the availability of information and data, and if you're going to do a risk assessment, is it something that I can update it as fast as possible? And on top of it, is it something that complies to legal and contractual requirements? Which is why there are some countries who adopt several risk assessment framework or risk management framework, and that would also follow that. In the U.S., you have the COSO as a bridge to comply with SOX and HIPAA. For New Zealand, we have the Australian standard and New Zealand standard for it, and in the Philippines, we go for basically what the auditing the local standards would comply. The same context also with your country as to what are the contractual requirements would there be to comply, so that if I follow the assessment, it shows that I am in tune with them. More importantly, I've given value to the organization by putting us a good reputation. And simply put, in all of these 8 factors, all of them are equally critical when we want to find out what makes a good risk assessment technique. And as mentioned in the guideline in 31010, you can choose one or a combination of both. So as long as at the end of the session, at the end of the risk assessment, they are something that that shows reasonable results to the top management. It is something that every team can perform? And is it something that it is within the bounds of the budget? And is it something that the data can be manipulated for? And is it something that well represents the nature of the risks? So all of these factors, to wrap things up, we have 4 watch points that I can leave. First is in the assessments and results may practically vary, and then it will depend on the depth of the detail. And that's why in the risk analysis, that's why in the risk analysis, for as much as you can, the team must be able to really drill themselves to a careful analysis, such a manner that at the end of that session, you will be able to evaluate the risk properly. Just keep in mind that a good risk a well-evaluated risk will depend on how well it is analyzed. That also follows that how well is the risks properly identified. And finally, as I have already outlined the succeeding 2 bullet points, which risk assessment techniques. The use techniques must be justifiable, and that it must provide results that enables a good understanding of the risk. And finally, as it is a risk management, or should we say, as the risk assessment constitutes the entire bulk of performing it and putting it in a risk management framework, it is something that as it moves forward within the enterprise, it is the results, the action plans, the histories behind the information that was collected should be something that's traceable, repeatable, and verifiable. There's a challenge for most organizations that when you talk about implementing a risk management framework, we're left with the question, is it something that's auditable? A lot of people are asking that. Is risk management, is 31,000 an auditable standard? Well, as much as it is a guideline and it contains should statements, it follows that it is not. But it is something that gives us a good benefit, because the 31,000 also tells us that you can create a criteria that enables the risk management framework to be auditable by nature. And how auditable would that be? It will depend on the organization. And it really is up to the organization. After all, it goes in the principle. If you have attended the previous webinar on the principles of principles and culture, which I conducted some months back, we talked about risk management framework is something that's custom tailored, not a one-size-fits-all scheme. And with that, as it is a 30-minute webinar, and as much as there are a lot of things that could be talked about assessing risk or selecting the techniques. I'm much open to listen to your questions, everyone. See how can we steer up a conversation. So before I would close it off, I'll just go back to this slide so that you will remember so that it will be easily remembered. What are these three things that you need to remember when you select a risk assessment technique? First, resources. Second is the degree of uncertainty that you are dealing with, and finally, how complicated should the application be? Thank you very much.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on this subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for enterprise business process improvement, automation, corporate governance, access, and compliance management. Thank you for listening. See you next time.